All right, the brain, part three. Try to break this down into small units. So we started with the brain stem, went to the limbic system, and now we're looking at the outer covering of the brain. So these images are excellent to really see how the brain is put together from a cross section and kind of where things reside inside a full brain. So we have two hemispheres, and we'll talk more about kind of hemispheric specialization a little bit later. But this outer brain is called the cerebral cortex. And this is our CPU. This is our where we process information. This is where we make connections. And if you remember at the beginning of the chapter when there was a discussion about phrenology, the one thing that phrenologists had correct was that there seems to be certain areas of the brain that are responsible for certain things. So that's how we want to break down the cerebral cortex. Now, if you'll notice that when the brain has all these fissures and cavities and things like that, that's because if we would take the cerebral cortex and lay it out flat, it'd be about the size of an open newspaper. All right, so obviously if we went around with big newspaper-sized heads, that would be problematic. So scrunch it all up, put it in a skull, sits on top of the body very nicely, and we go from there. So 4 lobes. Okay, so 4 lobes in the cerebral cortex, and we find these lobes on both sides. Okay, so we have right frontal lobe and left frontal lobe. Okay, so here are the 4 lobes: frontal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe. All right, nicely colored here. All right, so location is one thing you need to know: frontal, temporal, parietal, occipital. Now, what do these areas do? So there's also some more specialized cortexes that reside in those 4 major areas. The first one to talk about is the motor cortex, which is at the very back of the frontal lobe. It's the last section of the back of the frontal lobe on each side. And then at the very front of the parietal lobe is the sensory cortex, okay, which helps to some degree understand some of the major functions of those lobes. The parietal lobe is mostly processing sensory information. The frontal lobe is a little bit more involved. So you'll notice here in these breakout diagrams, they have these funny kind of looking images associated with different sections of the motor cortex. And basically what we're looking at here is that you'll notice that the maybe where the elbow is, there's very few, it's small, all right, which means that the number of neurons and the density of neurons in the motor cortex in this area are fairly limited. Okay, now where do we have the most control over voluntary movements and gets a lot of use? Our face. So there's almost half of the motor cortex is dedicated to the muscles of the face. Okay, lots in the hands. The hands is almost another third, quarter, and then everything else. Okay. Now, what's interesting, and this can be broken down, right in one hemisphere, right hand, the other hemisphere, left hand. If you're a violinist, for example, or you do something very intricate and involved with the hands, the area of the motor cortex that is dedicated to that body structure is going to strengthen. So those neural networks will strengthen. they'll become healthier. They'll become more neurons will be dedicated to those tasks. All right, probably at the expense of something else. On the sensory side, same kind of thing. If you think about the parts of your body that are most sensitive, okay, sensitive to touching, to pain, to whatever. So how much of the sensory cortex is dedicated, connected to pathways for that part of the body. So again, our face is sensitive, our hands are sensitive, okay? But the trunk of our body, not so much, okay? So that's an interesting way to, I think, visualize the motor and sensory cortex. Okay, so where do we see? If your mom ever told you that she has eyes in the back of her head and you cannot get away with anything, she's part right, because we actually do see in the back of our brains. That's where all the visual processing is going on. Okay, so this MRI here shows a subject who's looking at faces. We see the visual cortex activated. We also see here the auditory cortex activated when for sound. Okay, so if you're listening to my voice right now, your auditory cortex would, if it was in an MRI, would light up just like this image here. And it's also these visual and auditory cortex also play a role in language development, which I'll do a separate video on. Okay. One interesting note here that is on this slide is that when we look at schizophrenics and who have with a common symptom is auditory hallucinations. They hear voices. And what we're seeing is that their auditory cortex is actually functioning. It's actually active. So they do hear these voices inside their heads as if the person was in the room. Okay, then finally everything else that isn't dedicated to, there's a couple other ones that we'll get to when we talk about language, but for the most part everything else is association areas. So this is, I like how how it's referred to here as the uncommitted areas. We get to decide what goes into those areas. So when I say things like car, and some of you might think about the car you drive, some of you might think about a sports car, some of you might think about what Batman drives. We all have different associations, okay? And based on our experiences. So that's what starts to separate the differences between all of our brains, is that we have different information and we associate things differently based on our experiences. So our backgrounds, if they're in biology or psychology or politics, sports, whatever it may be, the associations we make with new information is going to be different. And where do those associations reside, and where do those associations get connected? In the association areas of the cerebral cortex. And you can see how much of it, compared to the chimpanzee, compared to the cat, compared to the rat, is really what starts to separate, another thing that separates us from the animal kingdom. All right, I'm going to talk about language in a separate video, so we'll end this one.